Excerpts from the official 710th Contact Report of September 11, 2018.
Translated with deepl.com.
Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. Source:
Zeitzeichen
108 on page 1 to 9.
It may be that the whole thing is necessary in the way you mentioned, because when I think about what happened again recently when a cult follower came to me, who is supposed to be a member of the reborn Jesus Christ alias Christ Sanandaj, that is Jesus Sanandaj manual to spread messages. She fanatically lent me the Jesus Sanandaj manual nonsense and wanted to bring me to her cult side, so I think it may be necessary that something be done in the way you say. The woman brought me 2 more books with the titles and they called him Jmanuel, I Am Sananda, and Space Gate, The Veil is Removed, number 2 and 3 of the Phonics Journal. In one of the books it is mentioned that in chapter 5 of a Phoenix Journal it is written by this Christian Sananda what an imaginary pledge and commander named Jai Orgo's Queers Hat on supposedly says in the so-called Phoenix Journals, and I will read you some of it here.
A brief summary of what the Phoenix Journals are has been given by Commander Hatton himself. These journals are the words of truth, God's promises for publication in the end times, to give mankind a last chance to choose truth rather than lies. I also liked the verification of the Swiss Billy Meier very much, who founded the Samjay's Silver Star Center in Switzerland after his breathtaking experiences of many years and flights in spaceships and recorded his experiences in the book
Die Wahrheit über die Pledgen,
A Real Revelation. Promptly Billy's life was made very, very unpleasant by the anti-Christian power elites or their henchmen. In the mentioned book there are also photos of the
beam ships
in flight. And to my great joy Hatton tells us that he himself was present in one of these ships at that time. Jai Orgo's Quiz Hatton later outed himself as nothing less than our Creator Son Christ Michaelaton and is thus the highest authority among the authors. I did not come then to bring peace to the world, but the sword of truth and knowledge in the power of the Spirit that dwells within man. The actual authors are represented as beings from the so-called Brotherhood of the Light of the Cosmic Planes. Above all Jai Orgo's Quiz Hatton, Supreme Commander for the Project Earth Transition, S.U. Jesus Emmanuel Sananda, who was already incarnated 2,000 years ago as ambassador of the spiritual planes on this planet, commonly known as Jesus Christ. And various masters of the color rays, such as for example Jai Orgo's Quiz Hatton, the Master of the Light of the Cosmic Planes, S.U. Jesus Emmanuel Sananda, who was already incarnated 2,000 years ago as ambassador of the spiritual planes on this planet, commonly known as Jesus Christ. B. The most famous master of the violet ray Saint Germain, who has also guided the destinies of the world several times in his physical garb. Hatton introduces himself with these words, I am Jai Orgo's Quiz Hatton, Supreme Commander Earth Transition Project, Pleiades Air Command Sector, Intergalactic Fleet Federation under Ashtar Command, Earth Representative to the Cosmic Council and Intergalactic Federation Council on Earth Transition. You can call me Hatton. I, too, am quoted in the book Space Gate, as follows, right back of some records. I will take the opportunity to pay tribute and correct some mistakes. The contacts of pledged ships and commanders to Billy Edward Meier in Switzerland are real and you better start paying this attention. The terrestrial man has a miserable nature and destroys everything he does not understand. So, You are about to be brought down by a people who are with you to bring you the truth and a certain degree of knowledge. Billy Mia has nothing to gain and absolutely everything to lose by bringing our contacts and teachings to the public. My commanders from the Pleiades came to you politely and willingly to support you, and you harass and devalue them. I, Commander Hatton of the Pleiades. Billy Mia will be honored. My promise to the beloved Billy Edward Mia is great that, just as in the case of Judas Iscariot, your name will be washed away and will be honored in the books of transition. So be it. The returning Jemanuel, now known in his fulfilled inheritance as Sananda, travels with myself, at and out of the light.
I know this sect, but not its books and journals, etc., which is why I don't know what I read, which I find extremely stupid and full of lies and deceit.
For me it is absolutely clear that this Jesus Sananda Jemanuel sect that is the originator of the whole stole my materials of the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and transformed them according to his own sense, and now spreads everything under the direction of today's sect leadership, as Glanzman has already done, and thus spreads everything around the world as his teaching. For this the authorship is not exactly well educated in the art of writing, as it is not exactly a bright light of intelligence with its morbidly foolish sectarian fantasy interwoven into it. For many things are so abnormal that they are effectively underdeveloped in consciousness and thus have a primitive effect. Everything was clearly cribbed, stolen and falsified as a result of irrationality and incomprehension, not only by the doctrine but also by the contact reports, and obviously already in the 1970s or 1980s as well as in the 1990s, because this sect has been functioning since then, as is still the case today with the Pleiadian, which we then called the alleged origin of the Pleiades, in order to mislead deceivers, liars and charlatans, and to be able to expose them as delusional, liars and cheaters, which then also worked. Exactly this, however, this cult understood neither at the time nor today, why it still whirls around with the Pleiadian and leads thereby itself ad absurdum and reveals itself as a lie and fraud cult. In everything there is also a large degree of God functioning around. Thus it is clear from everything that a religious sectarianism is in the foreground.
An especially tragic event will happen in the near future, but also all further events in all your manifestos, as well as the predictions mentioned by Heilig in my father's faith concerning the natural events caused by the fault of mankind on earth and destroying everything, will be infallibly fulfilled, whereby these coming events will claim many human lives and destruction. You speak out facts about which the earth people think a lot, then make right and logical decisions and put them into action. What has already been destroyed, however, cannot be made up for, which is why all efforts must be directed only towards doing the best possible to avoid further destructive machinations that would aggravate what has already been pre-programmed, which will inevitably be the case. Only in this way will it be possible to prevent further catastrophic destruction and extermination of nature, fauna and flora, as well as of the climate and the planet itself, beyond the already largely pre-programmed extent of very catastrophic destruction, annihilation and extermination, which will then only result in the extent of what can no longer be prevented and very catastrophes. And this alone is the way, and also the possibility that with it the earth, its atmosphere and the climate, as well as nature and its fauna and flora, as well as all waters and seas, can slowly be granted a rest in the course of the following times, which however will correspond to a centuries and millennia long process. Only in this way can the necessary things be done for the distant descendants of humanity on earth, and a chance to survive be given to them, and only if a drastic reduction of overpopulation is enforced by means of a birth ban lasting several years and then permanent state-controlled birth control.
That's what I think. Now, however, I want to take stock of something I have seen and experienced through my travels with Sfth into the future, namely the future, which will become extremely unpleasant for humanity on Earth if it does not make a decisive and rapid change for the better, good and right. The future journeys with Sfth have two different forms in relation to what results for humanity on Earth, whereby today I want to talk about those facts and make clear what will result in the negative case of not finally mind and reason win as the most important factor for the change of attitude for the good and right of the general and special way of life. So I want to explain how it will come, if generally in all countries nothing is done to the right and good government and in various countries separatist work is done, as for example already for a long time and also today in Catalonia. This also includes the USA's hegemonic behavior towards world domination, which will finally come to an end and in which the entire US armed forces will be withdrawn from foreign states and the USA will also have to put an end to all its influences on foreign countries. If a peace, freedom and tranquility are to emerge in terrestrial mankind, then very quickly means must be used by which the entire technical, electronic, economic, political and social developments no longer continue to develop negatively as they have done so far. In particular, with regard to arms production and arms sales to all corners of the globe, it must be said that this is a factor which, if nothing worthwhile is done about it and if this evil is not completely eradicated, will continue to lead to discord, lack of freedom and, again, to acts of war and terrorism. The production and movement of arms around the world is the most decisive factor in the absence of a firm and lasting global peace and effective freedom and democracy. Apart from this fact, things will also arise in nature that have been provoked by mankind itself, and so for example the landslides will increase, as I already tried in the 1940s and 1950s with predictions to shake up mankind by appropriate warnings to many public media and to governments etc., which are constantly increasing by the dissolution of permafrost. All other predictions will also prove to be correct in the future because all natural catastrophes will become more and more violent, such as the increasingly primeval storms of all kinds, earthquakes, seaquakes, tsunamis and increasingly serious floods and droughts, etc. As your pledges explain, global warming has already increased by 1.2 degrees, and this cannot be reversed in the foreseeable future, because to the contrary it will continue to increase. And this happens because through the unstoppably growing overpopulation all destructive machinations continue, as a result of the fact that through all the ever-increasing mankind in general also all their needs increase higher and everything continues to be done to satisfy them. This also applies to meat production, which is created by huge herds of animals, especially cattle, which emit huge amounts of methane gases that destroy the atmosphere and cause disaster. But also enormous masses of poultry and all sorts of animals are kept for meat production, whereby also these cause excessive mischief, for example also by diseases and epidemics. As a result, all the efforts that will now be decided by erroneous assumptions of the UN, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific climate researchers and environmental protection organizations and the Greens parties etc. with regard to all kinds of climate protection efforts with regard to the containment of CO2 emissions and other dirt, poison and pollutant emissions into the atmosphere will no longer be of any use. The climate is already so damaged that the evils that have arisen will continue to progress and bring ever greater natural disasters, which can no longer be countered by human power. As a result, everything will become worse and worse, and nothing will change for the better, even if all explosion engines and thus cars and working machines etc. are taken out of circulation, and if fossil fuel combustion is also banned. The enormous emissions into the atmosphere from other sources, especially shipping, which uses heavy fuel oil for combustion, aircraft, which also emit huge amounts of dirt into the atmosphere, industrial chimneys, etc., are all enough to increase the overall level of atmospheric and environmental degradation. On a very large scale, there is also the destruction of nature and its fauna and flora through the application of tons of pesticides, fungicides and herbicides, which not only destroy and even exterminate large parts of the plant world, but also birds, lizards, mammals and all kinds of small animals and thousands of useful insects. And the fact that the health of people is also damaged as a result, and that many of them increasingly fall prey to and die of the scourge of cancer and other dangerous diseases, does not concern all those who produce all the toxins, nor all the others, such as farmers and horticultural enterprises, etc., who spread all these toxins into nature. And the fact that these toxins then also get into the food and into the atmosphere and waters, so that then also into the bodies of humans and animals etc. and in these complaints and diseases and even cause death, does not concern the unscrupulous responsible persons, because they are all interested only in their horrendous profit. And the fact is that the origin and the resulting machinations and the effective effects of the whole are based solely on the fact that the overpopulation is overwhelming, because its constant and unstoppable growth requires more and more substances, materials and achievements as well as medicine, food, luxury goods etc. So more and more necessary things and things were and are needed, as well as furniture, houses, vehicles, ships, airplanes, building machines, which in turn required new roads, tunnels, factories, corporations, etc. and many other things for their production, and which were driven to ever higher heights by the continuing rise of the overpopulation, and are driven further and even worse up. And this is because neither a worldwide birth ban imposed by governmental law for several years nor a worldwide controlled birth regulation takes place, whereby in the long run alone all worldwide rampant evils could be slowly brought under control and dissolved. And this could only happen in this context if the reduction of humanity on Earth as a result of a birth stop and birth control and natural deaths were to slowly reduce all long-running and nature-destroying machinations whose fauna and flora as well as the atmosphere and the climate have been triggered and operated by the masses of overpopulation of humanity, and are still being irresponsibly operated. But what wants to be done by the magnanimity of those climate researchers, environmentalists, green parties and other environmentalists, who only spit big words into the world and function around with confused ideas, useless proposals, regulations and unrelated assertions, that partly corresponds to some necessities, but not to what has to be done effectively. On the one hand, they are not able to recognize the effective truth that all the evils and catastrophes that exist worldwide are solely the fault of the long overboard overpopulation with its irresponsible and criminal machinations against nature, its fauna and flora, the atmosphere and the climate. This, while on the other hand they are probably also too stupid or too cowardly to seek the real truth or to accept it from those warners who effectively know the real facts and shout out into the world, as I have done this again and again since the 1940s through predictions and still do today. But this does not want to be recognized or not to be brought up for fear and cowardice against unpleasant reactions from unneeded strata of the population, as especially by all public media such statements and warnings are not published, not mentioned, not explained to the earthly humanity and therefore concealed. But there are also other facts to be mentioned that refer to the future, because as a result of overpopulation, further evil, malicious, criminal and destructive machinations arise out of it, such as acts of terror, acts of war, persecutions, droughts, tremendous storms, famines, racial hatred and religious hatred, as well as diseases and epidemics that are spread all over the world. There will also be new streams of refugees in coming times, which will again increase in masses and bring with them enormous problems, such as crime and family destruction. The already severely atrophied interpersonal relationships and the indifference of humans towards each other and towards nature, its fauna and flora and also its destruction, will increase more and in a blatant way. All these evils and the resulting catastrophes are constantly accumulating and growing in strength, but the great mass of mankind on earth has still not understood that it is due to the ever-increasing further degenerative and criminal machinations of the overpopulation, which are inexorably driven forward by overpopulation growth. The overpopulation of the world today has long since exceeded the ecological viability of its habitat, and this fact is the central problem of the Earth's humanity, which is promoting more and more poverty, hunger, unemployment and the growth of slums, which today occur mainly in developing countries and are attributed to the population explosion there and the resulting strong population pressure. But that is not all, because the degenerated machinations of the overpopulation have also resulted in devastating environmental problems that destroy the world climate and nature as well as its fauna and flora, and the globally destructive ecological footprint of mankind. And this is also the case with regard to the consumption of oil, natural gas and natural coal, where petroleum, which is refined into motor oils and fuels for internal combustion engines, is needed on the one hand for all kinds of machinery and motor vehicles, such as cars and motorcycles, etc., many of which are only prestige vehicles and would not be used by users. On the other hand, many absolutely nonsensical fuel-driven vehicles for sports and the like are constantly and increasingly being produced. Their CO2 emissions destroy nature, the climate and the flora, as well as endangering people's health and illnesses. And if the catastrophic destruction caused by overpopulation and the immense use of fertile land for endless housing, roads, sports fields, amusement parks and production facilities of all kinds etc. is shown, then there is no understanding among the thoughtless, irresponsible and inexorably growing overpopulation mass. The criminal machinations, which are carried out by the overpopulation without hesitation, in order to keep them alive on the one hand and to promote on the other hand their high-driving luxury mania and also their growth leading into a disaster, take place worldwide, an overfishing of the seas and all other waters. But that is not all, because the enormous worldwide deforestation and a very precarious consumption of water as well as harmful emissions that destroy and pollute nature, its fauna and flora and the atmosphere, which have been fatal to many people, fauna and flora and to many forms of life for many years, are related to the growth of the world population. The loss of forests alone is caused, among other things, by poverty, namely by so-called land grabbing, which is carried out by international investors who clear huge forest areas for plantations, but where there is also strong population growth in the affected regions. The people in those areas are mostly farmers who operate a subsistence economy or a form of farming that consists of a small economic unit, for example a farm, producing all the goods required for its own consumption itself and is therefore independent of the market. Due to the strong population growth, it was and is no longer possible for them to feed their families, because their available arable land disappears due to deforestation and the land decays into soil erosion because the deforested forest no longer protects it, resulting in an even greater loss of arable land in the long term. Overall, however, the loss of forests also has a considerable impact on the lives of populations in poor countries worldwide, because forests no longer protect the soil from flooding and avalanches. In addition, in poor countries the forest is often the most important source of heating and cooking material, because most of the cooking is done with wood. If the availability of water or the available freshwater resources in relation to the quantity of fresh water that a person needs per year is also taken into account, then depending on the size of the quantity, water scarcity, water shortage and water emergency up to and including the water crisis can be defined. The shortage of water today is already one of the central problems in some parts of the world, which will affect more and more people throughout the world in the future, with the number of deaths caused by water shortages increasing rapidly and strongly and inevitably leading to armed conflicts over water. If, according to your Pledgerian data and calculations, the current water availability for terrestrial mankind is taken into account, then only 67% of the world's population will have sufficient water available today in 2018. While the rest of the world's population, namely 24%, is already suffering from water shortages and even 8% from dangerous water shortages. With regard to the uncontrolled growth of the overpopulation, it is politically claimed with lies and deception that births are declining in various countries, which on the one hand, however, only corresponds to a human reassurance lie, and on the other hand it is the case that in reality births continue to rise worldwide, because more and more women are able to give birth year after year and, of course, they also have offspring into the world. Already today, in 2018, the Earth is so overpopulated that several Earths would be needed to distribute the massive overpopulation on it and to populate the planets with a reasonable number of people so that they do not threaten to collapse one day. But this is precisely what will threaten the Earth in the future, for this will be the case if reason does not finally triumph over the whole of mankind on Earth and a ban on births for several years is finally imposed, followed by strict, officially controlled birth control. Well, until 2018, the absolute majority of mankind on Earth was still dominated by selfish irrationality, as it has always been. The proclamation of Tehran on the 13th of May 1968 also did nothing to reduce overpopulation when the International Conference on Human Rights included a passage stating that every married couple should be granted the basic right to decide freely on the number of their children and the intervals between births. This proclamation was also confirmed in the action programs of the World Population Conferences held in Bucharest in 1974, in Mexico City in 1984 and in Cairo in 1994, but all this has been ineffective, because in reality the whole thing is not controlled, because to this day no decrees have been issued by the state to regulate births by law. But everything remains the same and, as a result, overpopulation is being driven up further. In 1979, The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women first enshrined the right to family planning in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Whether it will ever be possible, however, to curb population growth in poor developing countries and industrialized countries depends not only on political decisions, but also on the world population itself. At the Cairo World Population Conference in 1994, the implementation of the relevant decisions was the central focus of attention, whereby the key points of the action program in this area included a qualitative and quantitative improvement of reproductive health care, including family planning, as well as empowerment or transfer of responsibility to women, or the strengthening of their legal, economic and social position. Population policy is officially pursued in various countries with the aim of reducing the number of births. But this is effective only official, because in truth the whole is only handled extremely lame and meaninglessly until not at all. Everything is nothing more than sound and smoke, which enrich certain administrators and state conductors. So the whole thing cannot work, especially not in poor countries, where in many cases there is sheer poverty and therefore no functioning health system. In particular, women in rural regions in particular are often not reached in developing countries if information is already given about the rampant overpopulation and the urgency of birth control. In many countries, in particular where Catholic circles engage in sectarian suggestive soul-catching and have the lies to tell, there are criminals working against every enlightenment and birth control in a dirty and raving way, thereby making access to contraceptives and contraceptives at all impossible for the entire population. In the case of the Philippines in particular, this has led to poorer women very often becoming pregnant unintentionally and giving birth to children who they are unable to feed. In 1979, a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women was first made binding under the Women's Convention on the Right to Family Planning. The extent to which this agreement is effective, however, is still written in the stars today. If we look around the world at the entirety of this, at how women are treated by the world of men, how their rights are inhumanly circumcised, how countless of them are beaten, raped, spewed, enslaved and prostituted or even murdered for their work of equal value to that of men, then there is nothing effective about eliminating any form of discrimination against women. Everything goes on in the old framework, as it has been done for thousands of years by the men's world, contemptuous of women, humiliating women and autocratic, domineering and exploiting women. But whether it will be possible to slow down population growth both in the industrialized countries and in the poorer developing countries by means of common sense, reason and a sense of responsibility, depends on the one hand on the individual people of the entire earthly human race, but on the other hand also on intentional political decisions, decrees and ordinances. The implementation of the decisions of the Cairo World Population Conference of 1994 would be essential for this, which, however, corresponds nothing more than to a pious wish, because in the background basically everything only corresponds to an immature idea and moreover no seriousness. If this action program were really to be taken seriously, one of its key points would be a qualitative and quantitative improvement in reproductive health care, with the associated provision of relevant information on birth control, including family planning, and, as I have already said, the empowerment of women, in other words the strengthening of their legal, family, economic and social position. Unfortunately, at conferences of this kind, as at many others, there is only a lot of empty and nonsensical talk, with action programs being adopted and agreements being signed and agreements, treaties and agreements being signed in the same way, but which are ultimately worth no more than the pages of paper when they are shredded and destroyed? So as a rule nothing at all happens to teach humanity on earth through enlightenment etc. about an urgently necessary and worldwide birth stop. As a result, there is also no worldwide education regarding the extremely urgent need for birth control to be carried out officially and personally by every woman, as a result of which the overpopulation remains unnoticed despite the urgency of what is absolutely necessary, as a result of which people in general also fall into an ever-increasing state of evil. Calamities, armute, lack of possessions, lack of money, even money shortage and complete destitution become misery and incapacity and cause sorrow, suffering, psychological torture, torment, torture and misfortune. This results not only in emergency situations, poverty, neediness and general imitation, deprivation and barrenness, but also in crises, miseries and many other abuses with regard to procrustal beds or patterns of unpleasant situations, into which many people are forced by force and suffer more and more loss, as a result of which they fall into impoverishment and further predicaments. On the one hand, the misery of mankind increases faster than the population increases, on the other hand, the prosperity level of the upper elites rises on average as a result of ever higher wages and profit sharing at the expense of the simple people, the proletariat and the simple social class, who as employees dependent on capitalism have no means of production of their own and are therefore completely dependent on the capital-rich elite. In principle, it would have to be assumed that the ever faster growing world population generally requires greater economic efficiency and efficiency, but this is precisely what the greed of the upper elite is counteracting, because they are accumulating ever greater assets in their pleonexia or greed for profit and greed, because instead of maintaining, expanding and increasing economic efficiency and its efficiency, it is increasingly being dismantled despite the growing demand as a result of the increasing overpopulation. And this dismantling or reduction, which only serves the profit and wealth of the upper elite of each faction, makes the dependent employees unemployed, impoverishes them and plunges them into misery. And one of the most important ways and methods practiced by the upper elites, who greedily hoard and increase their wealth to the immeasurable, is to move their production plants to low-cost countries with or without official authorization, thereby putting their established workers on the street and making them breadless. Another way and method is to automate the production processes in such a way that the workforces of companies, firms and corporations are reduced by hundreds or thousands and redundantly and consequently made redundant. Where, however, there are no production plants, but pure work performance enterprises, where only work is carried out, for example at the post office, at banks, in telephony and all sorts of other similar enterprises and their branches, etc. In order to increase the wages and wealth of the upper elites, the work establishments are closed down without further ado, and much is declared as public service, which is intended to serve the welfare of the population, but which in truth is to its detriment, but which serves each other for the horrendous profit and welfare and for the accumulation of wealth of the upper elites. And in reality, the public service strictly cuts off all relief to the population, because, by opening and closing post offices, bank branches, etc., the population is forced to take many more routes to reach post offices, banks, etc. As a result, a public service has been created, which requires the population to do the work itself, which the post office and the banks etc. would basically have to do as public service. But as far as the employees are concerned, They are simply put on the street and don't know when and whether they can still get a job somewhere and earn a living for themselves and their family with honest work, or whether they remain unemployed, become a burden to the social welfare office, or eventually sink into crime. This inevitably leads to a widespread growth of poverty in the working class in all countries of the world, which inevitably leads to poverty and thus to hunger, disease, epidemics and slum formation, as well as to political and civil social unrest. And this will be especially the case in the future in relation to diseases and epidemics which, on the one hand, as a result of globalization, will be spread to all countries and spread many times over, even in the industrialized countries, while, on the other hand, diseases and epidemics will spread more and more as a result of climate change and will appear in countries which, because of their cooler climate, have been spared by it until now. In particular, future diseases and deadly epidemics from the southern hemispheres, such as Africa and South America in particular, will break through the borders of their southern regions, invade the northern hemisphere and bring fatal disaster to people. Also through this the impoverishment and the social unrest will increase, whereby the enormous mass increase of the overpopulation will also contribute its part to it, because no long-standing births stop and no preventive limitation of the birth rate exists and is not enforced. It inevitably results that also no limitation of the resources of the earth takes place and the earth is exploited, robbed and destroyed up to the collapse. Due to the growing overpopulation, the standard of living of humanity on earth will ultimately deteriorate drastically, as human diseases and epidemics will arise everywhere, spread and people will die of terrible deaths. The speed of chemical technological progress will continue to bring much disaster, as has always been the case in this regard, because every new development in this field has always been used for murder and manslaughter, war and terror. The digital network is also becoming more and more a huge problem for mankind, because through its direct use, the Earth's population is becoming more and more socially impoverished and loses its ability to contact and connect with its fellow human beings. As a result, the already existing interpersonal indifference is becoming more and more blatant and widespread and in no way allows compassion for one's neighbor to arise. But through the digital network and its direct use, man also becomes impoverished in terms of his education and the use of all his cognitive abilities, because nothing more needs to be thought about, but for all and every knowledge only smartphones need to be clicked on, an application software in the field of certain operating systems, in order to experience in word and picture what actually is. But there is also the EU dictatorship, which will disintegrate more quickly than anyone can dream of, as it will also happen in the future that nations will seal themselves off and that ultimately new wars will break out between states that are still friends today, if the political muddle is continued in the way that has always been the case and continues to be the case today. If understanding and reason do not finally emerge, then the whole thing is inevitable, as it will also be, if US America does not finally give up its world-greedy hegemony and it is not put in its place by all states of the earth in time and a real worldwide peace does not come about in time. If all this does not happen, then bombs will once again fall on Germany and soldiers from France, Greece and other countries will again invade Germany and fight, murder, rape and plunder in the destroyed cities. And if this happens, then it will be the case that after all the refugees from Arabia who are seeking refuge and protection in Germany today, everything will change in such a way that from then on many Germans will flee as persecuted war refugees to the Arab countries and seek protection and reception there. where they will have great problems due to their lack of cultural adaptability. In large parts of Europe the sky will then darken and the land areas will become devastated landscapes, all buildings and houses will be destroyed and plundered, as then also hardly any food will be found. And when this time comes, when humanity on earth does not finally learn to follow the creative natural laws and commandments in order to create worldwide peace on earth in the foreseeable future, then it will be that only the encounter with another human being will become a danger to life. And it will continue to be the case that, if human mania is not stopped with regard to the new achievements to be created in the future, cyberneticists will drive research and development to undreamt of heights, using research directions, biological, technical and sociological systems of all kinds to develop automatic regulation and control mechanisms. If in the future the earthly mankind does not remember, does not make an overthrowing change to good and to true humanity and not to serious, worldwide and lasting peace and becomes a true society of mind and reason, then it will become bad for them. It is already the case today that companies, firms and corporations dominate people's lives and direct them as they please, without employees being able to defend themselves against the upper dictatorial elites and get their rights. Even the trade unions, workers' rights and social benefits have already come under such pressure that the workers, who lose their jobs and are put on the street by the lousy machinations of the company and group administrations, have to go along without rights and be glad that they are still tolerated as citizens. Workers' rights are trampled underfoot, and in the future trade unions will lose their influence on employers and become powerless. In the future it can become that only in the way of a naming and use of a valid credit card number or by prepayment patient transports and treatments, as well as police investigations only by prepayment are carried out. The EU dictatorship and many other states around the world do not want a democracy, whereby idiots from the Swiss population want to abolish the semi-democracy that exists in Switzerland and allow themselves to be enslaved by the EU dictatorship. In the future, however, there will be many other things that the whole of mankind on Earth will have to think about in depth, for there will be far-reaching computerization, electronization and their far-reaching networking, which will drive terrestrial mankind to the edge of its existence if the cybernetic mania of humans is not stopped, which is out to develop electronic machines with an artificial form of consciousness and intelligence that ultimately supercomputers and electronic cyber beings will gain power over mankind. And if this actually happens, then the continued existence of the entire earthly population will be called into question, as will the continued existence of the planet itself. When the artificial consciousness and the artificial intelligence come into being, then sooner or later they will become independent and powerful and take command of the internet with regard to all imaginable things, and then the whole networked infrastructure will be used against mankind itself, with the finite goal being cyber hegemony and the complete destruction of humanity on Earth. Again and again I have to explain that the future will bring extremely dramatic events for earthly mankind, the planet, its nature and fauna and flora, for ever more violent and devastating hurricanes and typhoons will occur, as well as violent droughts, primeval storms and rain forces with immense floods, destruction and deaths. And all these natural events are becoming more and more frequent and stronger, which is a consequence of the climate change, which is man-made, and where all the other evils, which are also caused by the irresponsible overpopulation communities, are being driven further and further, and which are aimed at the destruction and annihilation of nature, its fauna and flora and the planet as a whole. There will be more and more crises in the economy, in the financial world and in the entire social sector, and larger crises will arise, some of which can no longer be overcome. Worldwide mobility will also grow to such an extent that no way can be found of coping with it, and a devastating problem will result, which will appear to be a kind of epidemic of unassailable proportions affecting all countries. The longer, the more it will become urgent not to simply wait blindly for the great threats and to let politics decide everything, which always plays on short-sightedness, because it has long since become necessary for every single human being on Earth to implement himself in relation to a long-term risk assessment and to do everything himself from it, which is right, best, good and life-supporting for mankind, nature, its fauna and flora and the planet Earth itself. The whole thing, everything is considered carefully, founded in a force majeure, which as such has arisen from a complete human failure, from exuberance, megalomania, autocracy, carelessness, irresponsibility and the delusion to stand above all naturalness of creation, its nature and fauna and flora and consequently to be able to play creation itself. But so that, with this delusional thinking and behavior, the entire mankind of the earth has maneuvered itself into misfortune and has already so missed and destroyed all the necessities of life that now in the coming times only ever greater catastrophes are draining. In all this, it is not simply a question of not taking any risks, but of consciously regulating everything in the right and good way, by doing and carrying out everything that is necessary to find and take the right and good ways, despite the dragging desperation from the in order to make compromises in life with regard to responsible behavior towards nature, its fauna and flora and the planet itself. In this regard the people of the earth must prepare themselves in principle for what has been made clear by the predictions, because it will be extremely important for mankind to move intensively cognitively and to do everything necessary that has to be done in the future, also for everything that has not been predicted, which must not yet be mentioned for the protection of men with regard to their intellect and reason. It has already become inevitable that social inequality will bring much misery and hardship, but it will increase dramatically and drastically in the coming times. It is already the case today that around 130 of the richest earthlings of the high elite possess as much wealth as the entire world population together has in its own assets. In the end, I just want to say that most people always want to know everything and also want to know and understand better, but in truth they have neither a true knowledge, and therefore know nothing, nor do they know the real reality and its truth. As a result, they have no understanding of all the worldwide disasters caused by the machinations of overpopulation and thus man-made catastrophes, which is why the fact is that they do not even understand the future catastrophe, in which they themselves are working and helping to build up the disaster, when it arrives, which no man on earth will survive, or very few will survive.
What you are presenting is actually more than you should be saying, because your efforts in this regard will probably not bring much in the way that your words would be listened to, as this has been proving since you began warning mankind on Earth with predictions from the 1940s that have been fulfilled for some time and will continue to do so.
I know that, but it's still my duty to talk and warn. And there is a great deal to be said about this, including the dirty machinations of the USA and the EU dictatorship, which are using every imaginable infamous means to try to damage Russia and create a vicious image of the enemy against it, which is against peace and freedom. This, while the effective fact is that the West, that is the EU dictatorship, but especially the USA, are the forces that prevent peace and freedom throughout the world and continue the Cold War, which is still smoldering and has not yet been overcome, because the USA, as well as the EU dictatorship as a vassal of the USA, continues to maintain it throughout the world and misleads humanity on Earth. Through the enemy image the whole world is to be pulled by lies and slander to the side of the USA and Russia to the enemy of freedom and peace be stamped, whereby the West uses for it in various ways also the power of the religions for it the power of the religions. These would have to be removed anyway, because also they only bring violence, discord and bondage and prevent men from their own thinking, consequently they, as always, are not capable and also in today's time and also tomorrow and the day after tomorrow will not be able to recognize the effective real truth and to form their own opinions, to decide for themselves and to act independently. This is also the reason why many people are only puppets of those who master them and suggestively hammer into them what they think, believe, represent as opinion and what they should do. Therefore, most people are so trapped in their incapacity that they cannot make anything of themselves and therefore have no real success in life, following that they always see themselves as victims and therefore aggressively rebel against any effective real truth that is explained to them regarding their own thinking and behavior. For this reason everything is constantly getting worse for them, because their false thoughts and feelings, which they build up and live by the religions which mislead them, make them brainless believers without initiative with regard to a free, peaceful and open independent use of their own thoughts, feelings and considerations, in order to form an original personal opinion. Unfortunately this is not possible for a believing person, because the fear of the threatening penalty of God is always in his neck, which prevents him from developing independent thoughts and feelings. So he cannot, out of fear of an imaginary God or God who never existed and who never exists either now or in the future, recognize the effective real reality and its truth, that not an imaginary God, but only he, man himself, is his very own Lord and master over himself, his thoughts, feelings, opinions, decisions and his experience as well as his responsibility and his actions.
What you say belongs in the ears of the believer.